Well, sovereignty is kind of a tricky term, like you said. Basically, all that it means is inherent authority. It's the ability of tribal governments to act as governments. And this process here at the United Nations is a way of exercising that sovereignty. It's a way of exercising tribes' authority as governments to come here and speak as governments, not as non-governmental organizations or non-profits or anything like that, but as governments who are exercising self-determination on their land, who are making governmental decisions for their people, running social services, the full range of things that our tribes do. They can come to the United Nations and speak about those issues and talk with other governments, like the United States, like Mexico or Ecuador, about the kinds of problems and issues that are coming up for them. We want all indigenous governments who are legitimate governments, who are legitimately indigenous, to be able to come to the United Nations and participate in UN meetings that they're interested in participating in. We don't want the UN to set up a body that's going to select between indigenous governments which ones get to come. So when Cherokee Nation and Choctaw Nation both want to come to the UN, the body should not be selecting one of those. It should be accrediting both of them. So it's a way of ensuring that all qualified indigenous governments are eligible to come to the United Nations, to address the body, to share information, to participate in meetings in as many ways as they can.
After two intense weeks here in headquarters, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is concluding its 16th session tomorrow with the adoption of a report that includes the recommendations for member states, UN bodies, and indigenous people. The rapporteur's unedited version of the report will be available on the UN website after it is adopted, and the final report will be presented to the ECOSOC, to the Economic and Social Council, on July 2017, so in a couple of months from now. We have all enjoyed 2 weeks full of people from diverse countries around the world. More than 1,000 indigenous people's representatives attended the session. The discussions covered the main theme of the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other pertinent topics for indigenous peoples, including their participation in the United Nations, the implementation of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and issues affecting indigenous human rights defenders around the world.
I think it gives us a little bit of leverage and a voice. And you know that through networking, through congressional, through different states, to different governments, global-wide, I think this is where the world comes to see if they can actually get that kind of support. Yes, I think we've been involved for a numerous amount of years. Our cultural and spiritual leaders have come here throughout more than maybe 50, 60, maybe in years to the UN, to the federal governments, to see how we can voice our opinion and see if some of the items that we care about can be dealt with.
Bueno, yo soy Hernando Chindoy, pertenezco al pueblo Inga en Colombia y soy presidente del Tribunal de Pueblos y Autoridades Indígenas del suroccidente colombiano. En ese territorio hemos hecho una alianza de hermandad entre 9 pueblos indígenas de la zona andina y de la zona amazónica. Entonces son Aguá, Cofán, Eperara Siapidara, Siona, Nasa, Quillacingas, todos ellos junto a una alianza de mujeres indígenas del departamento de Nariño. Por ellos estoy aquí y es muy importante que en ese sentido podamos nosotros avanzar en el derecho a la participación que tenemos cada uno de los pueblos indígenas en el mundo. Nosotros creemos firmemente que la libre determinación debe llevarnos a que cada pueblo pueda tener el espacio garantizado para gestionar sus propios asuntos en cualquier espacio y lugar donde se encuentre. Y esa es la razón por la cual he venido. Le agradezco mucho a los amigos, a los pueblos indígenas que han hecho posible que yo esté aquí y que espero continuar dejando la voz desde el pensamiento que nos atiende a cada uno de los que estamos en ese territorio.
there is some pressure from the United Nations, there's some move in the United Nations to limit indigenous participation on a regional basis. So that they would say, the UN typically looks at the world and says there are 7 indigenous regions. Asia is one region, the Pacific is another, North America and other groups is another, Africa, and say for each of these regions we'll allow 1 indigenous representative to speak at this meeting or to attend this meeting or 2. And that's obviously a problem for us because our nations do not speak, our sovereign nations, and they don't necessarily all speak on the same issue. They don't all necessarily take the same position on each issue. So it's very important that each individual indigenous nation, indigenous people's government, have the right to come here and speak on their own behalf and not be funneled through a regional system of accreditation that would effectively create 1 advocate, 1 representative for each region. We think that would be unworkable, that would actually undermine indigenous sovereignty.
Madam Chair, on behalf of the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus, we submit the following recommendations. Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination in accordance with Article 3 of the UNDRIP and to full and effective participation in any decision-making that affects us. Furthermore, we call into question and reject any policies, procedures, and processes within the UN system that undermine or limit these rights. Extractive industrial development destroys indigenous peoples' livelihoods, lands, resources, and territories. We support the recommendation 7th Sessions report that the World Bank and other multilateral and bilateral institutions implement alternative systems beyond the perpetuation of highly centralized fossil fuel-based energy supplies. Furthermore, we demand the World Bank to divest from extractive and fossil fuel industries that continue to contaminate, pollute, and poison our lands, territories, watersheds, rivers, oceans, and air. We further call upon UN agencies to divest from the financial institutions that fund these damaging industries that threaten indigenous peoples and our livelihoods.
So today's meeting, the focus was really on enhanced participation of indigenous peoples at the United Nations. So it was our opportunity to look at all of these preambular and operator paragraphs relating to our rights and how we can participate and engage with member states in a very fair, impartial, and balanced manner. My estimation in general, I think, when you come to the United Nations, know you're in the place of member states. It is their house. Indigenous peoples are asserting themselves, to the best of their ability and to provide their legal precision and, to be articulate when we take the floor when trying to address these types of drafts, which is now in final consultation.
Yes, I just would like to pick up that there's a very important processes going through. We've mentioned some of those in the United Nations, but perhaps the focus for this year is this recommendation that Indigenous peoples have representation to the highest levels of the UN, that as peoples with the right of self-determination, we are not confident that our interests are represented by states alone, and that Indigenous peoples often have their own forms of governance institutions and decision-making institutions, and yet we still find that important decisions, including the adoption of the Declaration, are being taken at these levels in the General Assembly without Indigenous people's voice being involved and participating in there. And there's every argument as to why that should occur. It's meant to be beneficial, it's meant to be inclusive, and Indigenous people should be able to participate.
I think there's a couple of things that are going on there. One is this, like you said, there is some pressure from states to select 1 Indigenous person to speak for all Indigenous peoples, because that'll be a lot easier to deal with. You can solve problems if you just arbitrarily select 1 person as a representative for hundreds. So there is some of that that's going on. Some of it is more mechanical about efficiency. That there is a limited number of speaking slots in any meeting. You need to figure out a way to distribute those slots in an even and fair manner. So there is some of that as well. But I think that the negative aspects of this, the channeling of Indigenous peoples through a single voice, far outweigh the efficiency gains that the UN might see as possible here. So we want to push very strongly against that.
I'll just follow up on Les's and talk a little bit about why it's important that Indigenous peoples have this enhanced status. First, because they're not NGOs. But second, when governments come together to address some of the crises that the world is facing today, the environmental crisis, economic crisis, climate change crisis, indigenous peoples should be at the table. If you look, the proof is in the pudding. You've got over 80% of the world's biodiversity on indigenous peoples' lands. It seems like almost every week now, new studies are coming out that show that the best way to protect forests is to recognize the territorial rights of indigenous peoples. Les had mentioned indigenous peoples are guardians of over 90% of the world's languages. Language is one of the best indicators of the health of ecosystems. So if the indigenous language in the ecosystem is healthy, there's biodiversity there, and the ecosystem is healthy. They're also guardians to a lot of the world's medicinal knowledge, pharmacological knowledge, agricultural knowledge, and guardians of the vast majority of the diversity of agricultural seeds, genetic resources. So as the world comes together to try to address some of these issues, it's important to have the people that have all of that knowledge there at the table. And when we look at the issue of global climate change, reducing emissions is one big part of the solution, but also maintaining the integrity of these large landscapes that maintain the climatic stability of the planet is also just as important an issue. And the only place where we find intact large landscapes is where indigenous peoples have somehow managed to maintain control of their territories. So for indigenous peoples, sustainable development is not something that they're looking for or a new concept. That's something that they've been doing for thousands of years. And as the world's governments sort of grope their way towards figuring out what sustainable development means, I think indigenous peoples have a lot to teach them.
We have a number of states are very strongly supportive of our position on this issue, and we're optimistic going ahead that we'll get a good outcome. But many states have not engaged fully in these consultations in the past few months, and we don't know exactly where they all stand. So once they get behind closed doors, we'll find out a little bit more, hopefully from our friends and allies from the states that have been supportive of us, what's going on and what the hang-ups are, and hopefully we'll be able to work with our allies, with our partners, to find good solutions going forward. We think that there will be a resolution that is adopted, and we're hopeful that it will be a good resolution that will provide important new rights for indigenous peoples that will allow us to speak at the UN and be here on a more permanent basis. So.